Hey there, everybody. Welcome to my channel, The Magical Solution. My name is Lailani, and this is how we grow. Tonight, I'm really excited to have Cory Thomas Hutcheson on tonight. He is the author of the complete book, North American Folk Magic, Llewelyn's complete book of North American folk magic, to be exact. And this book is jam-packed with information by contributing authors such as Benebell Wen, Kenta, J. Allen Cross, Stephanie Rose Bird, Byron Ballard, Starr Cases, and a lot of other names that you may not have known before. And tonight we are going to be talking with Cory about his experience compiling these stories and learning about North American folk magic, whether it's stuff he already knew or stuff that he's learning for the first time. But before we bring him on, let's get to know a little bit about Cory. So Cory Thomas Hutcheson from Central Pennsylvania is the co-host of the popular podcast New World Witchery, which, by the way, is an amazing podcast. We will be linking it down below. Make sure you go to it, subscribe on all streaming platforms. He has a doctorate in American Studies with a specialization in folklore, religion, and ethnicity from Penn State. He is a contributor to the Oxford Handbook of American Folklore and Folk Life Studies and American Myths, Legends, and Tall Tales. And he has written for the popular occult publications, including Witches and Pagans. And you can find him and all of his information on www.corythomashutcheson.com. The information is down below. So without further ado, let's bring him on, you guys. Let's bring him on. Hello.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be here, Lailani.
I am so glad you said yes to me. This book is a wonderful encyclopedia / compendium of information on North American folk magic, and it's really, really, really good. You did a really great job with this, honestly. And I want to talk to you about it.
Well, thanks. Yeah.
Let's do
it. Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, I had something to do with it, but it's really about, like, there's tons of other really amazing people who contributed to it. So it's this kind of like collective labor of love. So I'm excited that it's out there in the world. So yeah, can't wait to talk about it.
Yeah, considering that it is a whole slew of amazing contributors and authors, some a lot of people may know and others they may not know. I think this is a really great opportunity to showcase everyone's voices. And I have to ask, when you were approached with getting this book together, what was like your reaction and where did you start? Because that's a lot of people that you got to contribute, like a lot.
My goodness. Yeah, no, and it definitely is a situation where I was overwhelmed in some ways, because I sat there and I thought about, initially I think it was kind of proposed as like a sort of like, well, let's look at folk magic, just generally folk magic. And pretty quickly, I think we all kind of agreed, like, well, there's too much of that. Like, you can't just do a big book of folk magic,
right?
Because there's just so much. It would be a multi-volume, an encyclopedia. And I'm not saying that somebody shouldn't do that. Somebody totally should do that. But when we kind of looked at it, it was like, okay, well, my area of expertise is North American folk magic, and so they kind of approached me about that. I have an editor that I worked with on my first book through Llewellyn, and she referred me to another editor who was working on the complete book series. And we got to talking. We started breaking stuff down. I was really impressed by how much she had thought about this as something that, like, me as like, cis white guy, trying to come in and talk about all these folk magical practices in North America, like, that's not going to work. Like, I can't be the one who says, like, so here's how you do hoodoo and here's how you do curanderismo. Like, that's not going to fly. Because one, it's a bad decision, in terms of, like, taking voices away, and two, I don't know that stuff with the intimate detail that the people who actually practice it do. I'm really good at, like, doing research, pulling on threads, finding people who do practice and talking to them about their practices. And so they said, well, why don't we just do that, but book form? And so that's really what this book is. It's a bunch of really wonderful practitioners sharing what they're willing to share, what they're open with sharing about their practices for readers, so that they can become more familiar with practices that they may not otherwise have encountered before. And we've got people
Right.
coming from so many backgrounds, because North America,
Yeah.
so many backgrounds, right? Like, and this doesn't even cover all of them. This is just a sampler, right? This is just,
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because when you think about North America, you're like, okay, Canada, the United
Yeah.
States, and like it's a pretty big freaking region.
Yeah.
So yeah, the book would have been like this thick if you were to cover it all,
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you said that, because these contributors, when you said that they contributed what they were willing to contribute,
Mhm.
I found that to be interesting, because some of the contributors wrote in like story format where they shared like folk tales and parables, and
Mhm.
others did almost like a lesson, and others did, like it was a different voice with every chapter, and it was so good to see that. It kept everything exciting. You wanted to see what the next thing was. So yes. Now, here's my question to you with regards to folk magic and folk practices.
Mhm.
When we say this word, folk magic or folk practices, some of the first things that get conjured up in our mind is indigenous practice. Like, you
Mhm.
immediately start to think of like Native American practices.
Mhm.
How is this different? Or is it different at all?
So we very consciously did not do indigenous practices, because there's so many indigenous nations and indigenous affiliations and groups within the North American region. They really deserve an entire book of their own. They really absolutely need to be represented top to bottom by indigenous folks who practice within these traditions. And I'm
Yeah.
hoping that book will happen. I'm hoping that book will happen out there. I will be an enthusiastic reader of that book the day it comes out, because I love learning about a lot of different practices from a lot of different cultural perspectives. But in the end, what we decided was, okay, so there are places where some indigenous lore crosses over, because there has been crossover historically. For example, a lot of indigenous plant lore winds up shaping African American hoodoo, because indigenous Americans and African Americans were both trying to kind of survive white colonization. And so there was some
Right.
crossover, as they're like, hey, you're hiding in the swamp. You probably need this to be able to survive. So like, here's some snake root, here's some things that you can use. So there is some of that sort of shows up in the crossover components, but largely the indigenous traditions, as they would sort of be represented by tribe members, are left to somebody else, a future book hopefully, that will really represent that fully and
Beautiful.
articulately. So yeah.
Yes. Yes. Beautiful. So then what would you define as North American folk magic? Is it that creation that comes from the clashing of all these different cultures and worlds, or is it something that was there before?
Mm.
What would you define that as?
That's a really excellent question, and in some case, it's a yes and, right? It's a both
Right.
and scenario, right? Because you get
Yeah.
to something like curanderismo. Curanderismo, it's not just like imported folk magic from Spain that winds up sort of sitting on top of something here. It is very much built on the backs of Nahuatl and Mexica practitioners, and some of the Aztec and the Mayan practices that have existed here for thousands of years.
Right.
And so that stuff does wind up in there. And so there is this pre-existing stuff that blends, I would say, kind of blends up and blends in with some of the stuff that's being brought over from colonization. But largely what we're looking at here is we're looking at kind of North America as a multicultural project.
Mm.
Sometimes willingly, often not willingly, a multicultural project, obviously. But then, because that has happened, because we have this multicultural landscape, what kind of practices have kind of come out of that? And you can't look at the institutional stuff, like what the Catholic Church said you were supposed to do when they were sort of taking over northern Mexico and the United States Southwest. that that's not that's not folk magic necessarily. The folk
Right.
magic originates with the folk. It originates with the people and the everyday things they had to do to survive and thrive in this landscape. And magic shapes that. And what's great is that all the folk from all the backgrounds have magic, and they have magic practices that they have been using for years and years and years. Sometimes they have similarities, sometimes they cross over, sometimes they share, sometimes they're very different. And all of it is just this really beautiful tapestry of different ways that people approach the problems. You know, some of the common problems that we have, like what happens if you're sick or injured? What happens if you don't have work or money coming in? How do you find people to love you? And how do you, how do you find people to love you? You know, like these are all things that
Right.
people care about, and every group finds their way through those problems, and pretty much every group also finds their way through those problems with some kind of magic. So this book very much focuses on like, what are those methods? What are those approaches?
And they can be both historically, like when you were saying that there's a lot of mixture there. There's a
Mhm.
lot of, and a lot of it is rooted in survival, whether that be survival of the elements or survival of systematic groups that are oppressing you. Whatever the war is, whatever the beast is, these practices tend to kind of stem in those oppressive states of survival and overcoming whatever
Mhm.
that may be. So knowing that, it's both historic and present, because I think in one of the chapters you were speaking about, not you specifically, but there was one chapter that talks a lot about like modern times and what the city looks like today and how these things are still practiced today without really focusing too heavily on the history, and more like, this is what we're doing here and
Mhm.
now. Like this is the context of the world that we're living in, and this is the folk magic that's actually coming out of it here and now, which I thought was really cool too. So I think what's interesting about this book overall is that it's very relatable. Like no matter
Mhm.
what part of North America you come from, there's like a piece from every chapter that you can look at and be like, that makes sense, even to me over here in the
Mhm.
countryside, or even me over here in the urban side. So
Mhm.
I guess I have to ask, what was your favorite part of compiling all of this? Was it the interviewing? Was it learning new things? Like, what's up? What was your favorite part?
It was getting the chapters back from the people that I had contacted and asked to talk about these things, and getting to read some of these really insightful pieces from people who had been doing this stuff for so long, and blowing my mind, because it was all stuff that, either I hadn't seen before, or I'd only kind of read about from a very kind of academically detached kind of perspective. And all of a sudden I have real practitioners talking about these actual things that they are doing. And like you said, it's contemporary, it's modern, yes, it's tied to the past, but it doesn't live there. It lives here and now,
Yes.
right? Yeah, and I love that, like where you can see that these are living traditions. We have one contributor, Kenya Coviak, who wrote about Detroit hoodoo, and hoodoo in Detroit, which is wonderful.
Oh
She's
yeah, that was
incredibly
the chapter.
knowledgeable.
Yes.
And yeah, and she talks about like these kind of like, you think of hoodoo, and a lot of people sort of think like, oh, that's 1800s is kind of the time period in their head. And she's like, I'm going to show you a hoodoo spell that is based on working in an auto plant. I'm going to talk about this, like this stuff that happens in these auto plants where like the paint drips down and makes these layers and stuff like that. And you get kind of a mineral out of that. And so what do you do with that? What do you do with this kind of stone made of all the auto paint? And I was like, mind blowing,
Boom.
mind blowing. Love this. This is what I live for. Is like, show me where the magic still is. And all the
Yes.
contributors did such a good job of that.
Oh my God, you said it perfectly. Show me where the magic still is. I fucking love that, bro. Because seriously, like, people just have like this strange obsession that old means good, or old
Mhm.
means better, or old means accurate, and we forget like we're still living, growing, progressing spirits that find magic in everything all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, like we're wired that way, you guys. We're wired that way. And so when you see this idea of folk traditions, don't be thinking that shit is all the way back there. Like I could say tomorrow that I have a folk tradition and that shit started with me today
Yes. Yeah.
in 1990 something.
Yeah. No, and people think like folk is this one thing. It's just your one folk thing forever. And it's not true. You
Right.
belong to multiple folk groups all the time. Like the people that you work with, whatever your career employment is. But we have lumberjack folklore. We have fire person folklore. We have mail carrier folklore.
It's
um
true.
if you belong to a chosen family, if you're queer, if you're LGBTQ plus,
There's
that chosen
folklore.
family becomes a type of folk that you can participate in. So yeah, we have living folk communities, and it's really important people understand that that's not a just like, well, I'm only this one folk community from the past. No, you're many folk in the
Yeah,
present, and all of those are going to contribute to who you are and the magic that you experience.
I love it. I love it. Now, Stephen here brings up a really great question, because as we kind of toy with this idea of history versus modern, there is a little bit of hesitation, a little bit of nervousness regarding having some of these older folk practices and accidentally losing that authenticity, losing that the history of it, because it's being what we would call gentrified. So
Yeah.
how do we reconcile this? Like, how do we kind of toe that line without harming whole communities and erasing whole voices? It's a tough question.
Yeah, yeah, and and as you know, as the white guy in the internet, right? Like, I'm not the one who's going to be able to say like, well, here's the solution, and let's just do this, because
Right.
people like me have been doing that for a long time, and we get it really wrong. So,
Yeah, but you're an
um,
ally, and so
yeah,
there are
that's right.
things that you've attempted. There's things that you've tried, and one of these is even a book like this where you've
Mhm,
highlighted some BIPOC voices, and
mhm.
that's one way of doing it.
Well, yeah, you can't talk about the folk magic without the folk. Like you have
Right.
to go to the people who actually do the magic and listen to them. I mean, the book and the podcast that we've done for years and years and years. We've done over 200 episodes. We've had like 150 guests, and we try to get people from those communities to talk to us because we want to hear what they have to say. That's
Right.
that's the best way. The surefire way to get gentrification in anything is to let people who are not a part of that community, particularly people who have power who are not a part of that community, based on whatever, but oftentimes based on kind of hegemony and cultural hierarchies that already exist. If you let them start deciding about what a folk community is, what folk practices should be recorded and continued, that's going to lead to gentrification really fast, right?
Oh
Because it
yeah.
becomes fashion. It becomes, oh well, I found this really cute hoodoo spell. That's not okay, right? Like, you want, if you talk to people who actually practice hoodoo, it can get real dirty, it can get real messy, and it pushes back against that gentrification.
It
But
sure
you have to
does.
listen to the people who are doing it, right? So that's a big thing. So Stephen, I think that's a great question that I don't
Amazing.
think I have a one answer to, but listening to the people at the
Exactly.
communities, I think that's the big thing.
And keep asking those questions. Those are the
Yeah,
exact questions that you
yeah.
keep asking every single time, over and over and over again,
Yeah.
because I think it's important to put that in the face of people, whether they have an answer to it or not. It's important for that awareness to be brought forward. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So thank you for handling that with such grace. I love it. So what was your sort of, what parts of the book did you feel like, oh, I'm really confident in this, like I know this stuff? And what parts of the book that you were like, holy crap, this is amazing, I can learn about this forever?
Sure. Yeah, the Upland South region, because that's where I grew up. That's where I'm really from. I'm back there now, actually. I think when we first were talking about this, I was still living in Pennsylvania, but I'm very comfortable with the Upland South stuff because I know that region. That's my home space, and there's a lot of the folk magic here that, even if I can't speak to all of it because some of it is not for me, but the stuff that I can speak to, I know from experiencing it around me in my childhood. So I feel pretty comfortable with a lot of the Upland South stuff. And I grew pretty comfortable with the stuff that had to do with Pennsylvania German areas, just because I was living in that area. I have a lot of friends. We've got one, Ralph, in here. So hi, Ralph, who has been a marvelous friend and a marvelous sharer of information about their practices and traditions. And I've had a lot of really wonderful people who've been willing to share. And that's something that I think is really kind of wonderful. Is, yes, there are close practices, and it's really important to understand that there are close practices, but there are also, most people are happy to share and talk about, as long as they think that there's going to be some respect, some respect for their boundaries about their practices.
For sure.
Um and I found that was true for most people who got involved with the book, because they were very, very quick to say like, hey, here's what I'm comfortable sharing, here's what I'm not comfortable sharing, and that's where I'm going to draw a line. Like, that's your line, I'm great with that, let's do that. And I think that helps a little bit. And so
Oh yeah.
it was wonderful to have that kind of like open dialogue with so many people and so many practices, and people want to share. People want to share these great, crazy, fun, quirky folk magical stuff that they're doing, and we love comparing notes. That's something I love about all magical people that I've met. Is like we love comparing notes and being like,
Oh my God.
like how did you get rid of that particular person that was causing you problems? It's like, well, I did this and
When
this
we're
and this.
not doing the magic, we're being the scholars.
Yeah, exactly. We're students. Folk magical people are very imaginative, and they're also very studious, because they have to. So many of these traditions are oral traditions, and so you have to be able to absorb information, right? But then you also have to be able to deal with problems on the fly, which means you have to be able to take that information and synthesize it, so that then you can use it in situations that you maybe haven't encountered before. So there's a lot of that kind of combination of thinking and imagination that has to happen, and I think that's a very natural mindset for a lot of folk magical practitioners. So.
Yes. Okay, I'm gonna totally just like talk about crap right now, but that episode in Charmed where Paige and Billy get locked up in a bank, and there's like a hostage situation,
Okay.
and Billy just empties out her purse, and she starts like rummaging through her things to see if she can come up with like a spell. And she used like foundation powder, she used some like a salt packet from like McDonald's, she poured in like a lighter fluid from her thing, and she did like this whole thing. And that reminded me of the quintessential experience of a folk practitioner, not necessarily being put in like a very dangerous, like in the corner situation, but definitely having a situation where maybe they have a person coming to them for help, or maybe there's a child being born that's now in distress. They have to move quickly with the items that are around them. And I think something about folk magic, and like you were saying before, you have to absorb the information, you have to be smart, you have to research, you have to know your environment. All of that prepares the practitioner. And I mean, knowing correspondences, knowing synchronicities, knowing all these different things is one thing, but being able, like you said, to conjure that up in a moment and put it into use, that is straight magician work.
It is. I mean, it reminds me a lot of being multilingual. I mean, because a lot of folk magic is about communicating with that spirit world and understanding, what does the spirit world want me to know right now? How do I get something from the spirit world, because based on the relationships I've built over a lifetime, right? And so it makes me think. There's an author, Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote a piece called "How to Tame a Wild Tongue," where she talks about like, she speaks 9 different languages, right? And you first start kind of reading this, and it's like, oh, well, she speaks English and she speaks Spanish. But then she says, yeah, and I speak Spanglish, and I speak Pachuco, and I speak not Mixteca, Chicano. She lists all these things that she's very involved, and at first people are like, oh, that's not a language. But she's like, no, you have to know when you need to use which language where, and each group of people you interact with is going to be different. So folk magic in a lot of ways is that. It's that like, oh, I need to get my message across to the spirit. How do I do that in a way that they're going to understand based on what I've got with me? And so you put that sentence together, right? You make a grammar of this. It's where grimoire comes from, is the word grammar, and so you put that together, you put your sentence together. Maybe it's with a salt packet and a cigarette butt, and I'm in a makeup poof from your purse. But you do it, if you do it well enough, and you know how this is working, and you understand it based on the traditions that you've worked with, and that's coming from your human, ancestral side, and it's coming from your spiritual, family side, your spiritual relationships. You do that to, you may not have a sentence that is like grammatically perfect, but your point gets across, right? And all of a sudden the spirit's like, oh, you wouldn't be sending me this unless you needed something. Let's get this done. So I think that's really, really important.
Yes. And to kind of to go back just for a second, when you were saying how the contributors to your book were excited, but there are boundaries, there are moments, especially when you're dealing with initiates, right? There's only so much they can say. So I find that interesting because, in my culture and in a lot of cultures where there's secrecy, there's this sort of special moment where when you're an outsider, when you're not an initiate, or when you're new to the field, there's this like special moment when an elder or a mentor or an initiate chooses you for just a few minutes
Mhm.
and drops a couple of nuggets of wisdom upon you.
Mhm.
And it's one of those moments that's so special and it's so yours. It's a blessing, it's personal. And sometimes I get really upset, when I see people online that's like, "Oh, I went to this botanica and this, palera showed me this and let me show you guys." And they do like TikToks and it's like, "No, no, 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 you guys. That was for you.
Mhm.
That was for you." And so this book is just that. It's a compilation of elders, of initiates, of practitioners who chose us for a moment
Mhm.
to kind of give us a little something, that we can share with each other and now utilize. And I think that's awesome, dude. Like, you did such an amazing job with this. You really did.
I mean, I appreciate that. It was so much more the people that contributed. They did
For
such a good job
sure.
sharing this stuff. I mean, I'm here to herd the cats, basically. And
Exactly.
they were pretty
Writings are
great cats.
beautiful. Yes, the writing is beautiful. So once again, before we keep going, take a good look at it, you guys. All right, Llewelyn's complete book of North American folk magic. Now let's talk about you, because we kind of went in and we talked about your experience writing this book.
Mhm.
We definitely know that there are some heavy hitter writers in here.
Mhm.
But who was the guy who put it all together and said, "Here's how I want to present it"? Who is Cory Thomas Hutcheson? How is folk magic in
Mhm.
your life? How does that affect you?
Sure. I've always been kind of really interested in folklore and folk magic. Like even as a little kid, I was very much like, what's this do? You know,
Yes.
well, if I put this and this and this together, does the thing happen? Um, and and I've always been very interested in, I grew up in the South, so there's this pervasive kind of, you know, there's everything's a little haunted, right? Everything's a little haunted, a little there's a little bit of spirit everywhere, which I think is true for a lot of places. I think that's true for most places, really. But in the South, we really front and center that. But then you also have on the other side of that, everything's a little haunted, and also there's a lot of Jesus. And so um and so but those things are not
Jesus.
necessarily incompatible, particularly if you're not worrying about the institutional version of stuff, right? So you wind up with a lot of like, well, we're going to pray about this, but and I grew up nominally Catholic. So there's a lot of folk Catholic stuff that influences me. So like one of my go-to responses for stuff is like, oh, something's wrong, let's light a candle about that, right?
Mm,
Which is, it's a function of kind of how I was brought up. You have
yes.
your little candle altar when you walk into a lot of Catholic churches and things like that. And that's not just Catholics. I've been to some Greek Orthodox churches. They have these beautiful sand trays where you put the little beeswax pillars in and stuff. So it's a very normal thing to do that kind of work. And so that's the kind of stuff I sort of grew up around. I would hear stories about, ghosts or haints. You'd hear stories about the Wampus Cat. You'd hear stories about Talipo and, all these kind of things that are out there, things that are wandering out in the dark.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of that. And at some point I started saying, well, I want to really look at this a little more closely. And for a while I kind of went in sort of a Wiccan direction because it was the 90s and it was like Charmed, right? Like Buffy, Charmed, those are the things. It's like
Yep.
the craft, right? Like, oh, that's the thing that I can look at. And it was fun. It was really informative. I studied at our court Gardnerian for a while. And it's wonderful. It's a wonderful tradition. But I started looking around and going, I'd been over to Europe and lived there and seen some really interesting folk stuff there. And so I came back here and I was looking around and I was like, well, wait, what about the stuff that's here? What about the stuff that's around me?
Mm,
And the more I poked and prodded, the more I was like, like, oh, well, why do we hang horseshoes the way that we do? Oh, well, because we're trying to hold in the luck, or in some places you're pouring the luck out, depending on where you come from, right? And it's like, well, what does that mean, right? Why do we do that? Um, why do we knock on wood when we worry that we've said something that we don't want to jinx, right? So why are we doing that? I didn't grow up specifically with any kind of like Italian influence on me directly through family, but I had, because I was in a Catholic church, there was a lot of Italian Americans who were there too. And
Yeah.
so like I would pick up things like, oh, if you feel like somebody said something about you, you get that little chill down your back that something was wrong. Maybe somebody gave you the eye or something like that. You kind of turn and go, you little spit to the side,
Yes.
right? And so that kind of stuff became very, very interesting to me, and I wanted to poke around. We had you lost something. If you lost something in my house, you were going to pray to St. Anthony. It was Tony, look around, help me find what can't be found. And you did it. And that was the thing you did. And all of that kind of started to contribute to the sense of like, oh, I have a system of magic that I've been working within. And it's got these kind of influences largely from sort of Catholic upbringing and some from the Southern upbringing. But that was the thing, is it was like, it's multiple threads that have come together. Right. And in doing that, I started to go, well, let me pull on those threads and follow them. And as I did that, I started to see, oh, there's threads everywhere. There's all these kind of amazing threads of folklore and folk magic. And so that's what kind of led me to study it more intensely. But it was definitely this kind of like Southern inflected, very Gothic. And that's not to say it's not a troubled history. There's definitely a troubled history with stuff in the South. And if you call a lot of magic around the people who are like, but Jesus,
right,
they're going to freak out. But if you're like healing or miracle or the Holy Spirit, right? They're like, that's fine. Yeah, you can do that. That's good. That's great. Just go ahead. So yeah, that was a lot of what I kind of grew up around.
It's interesting because so here's the second piece of these stereotypes that a lot of people often have with this idea of folk magic. So the first one was they automatically think Native American indigenous practice. But now another thing about folk magic is that it tends to always start with the monsters, the haunted spookies, or the superstitions, the bad lucks, that kind of stuff that is you need to be weary from, you need to protect yourself from, you need to ward from. And I remember growing up and learning really early on that a lot of these methods, just like Christian fairy tales, just like was used as like moral compasses and was used to like help children not be little assholes and stuff. And so it made sense, but why the spooky? Like why do we start there? You know what I mean? Like, does it appeal to the mind? Like, what's up with that? Is there any truth that that's how we kind of dive into the folk magic?
I mean, I think a lot of people come at it a lot of different ways, but you're not wrong. The spooky is definitely one of the. If you think about like all the doorways, it's the one with the biggest, the biggest door, big wood frame, giant knocker, kind of like
lights,
right? Like that kind of a thing. And I think that's partly because it acknowledges that we live in a spirit inhabited world, that we can acknowledge there is mystery and there are things that we don't understand. And this is you mentioned superstition, and superstition is important because people think of superstition as something they can dismiss. And I think from a scientific, rational point of view, there's reasons to do that at times. And you don't want to cling to stuff that's dangerous, obviously. And there's stuff that's really awful as well when it comes to superstition. Like people do terrible things to black cats because of superstition, and I don't approve of that. But I do think that when you think about the origins of the word superstition, like the sort of Latin origins of them, it kind of comes from super incitio, which is just the idea of overstanding something as opposed to understanding something. And that you understanding means that you get the mechanics, that you get how something works. You can go from point A to point D and you follow points B and C between, right? Overstanding is accepting that there is an order that you don't necessarily understand, but that you accept that order exists. And so you can see the relationship between something like leaving a jar of rice next to your door and you not being attacked by certain kinds of spirits in the night, right? Because they're going to have to count all that. Like, and maybe you get that they're going to have to count all that, and you don't necessarily know, like, well, why do they have to count all that? That's not the point. The point is that you know that they have to count all that,
right?
And so that's your thing that you're doing. So I think it's really important to remember that the superstition doesn't come from necessarily a place of ignorance. In fact, a lot of times superstition is coming from a place of repeated observation. It's I'm not going to say it's the scientific method, but it's not different than this idea of like, let's observe things. Think about weather patterns, right? Like we have, if you've ever heard the red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky at morning, sailor take warning, or anything like that.
I have heard of that in a long time. Wow.
Yeah. but those are the things, like, or like if you see the moon with her horns pointing up, like that's a wet moon. What does that mean? Well, it means that she's holding the water and there's not going to be rain for a while, right? And we see that, and we understand that that is information that we have picked up from years and years and years of observation,
Mhm.
and that we can read that and not understand it. We can read that and interpret it and use it in our daily lives, even if we don't necessarily rationally understand how it works. So,
Right. And I think part of being a magical person and part of engaging in these practices, whether you do so intentionally or not, or consciously or not, is that there is a certain compass that is led by intuition.
mhm,
Yes, you are observing these things that are happening to you, but for you to understand it the same way that you would understand an experiment done by the scientific method,
mhm,
we have to view it through the lens of our intuition. It it,
mhm.
it feels right, and we're seeing the correlation. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a
Like
really
it
good point.
feels to make sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, if you need to, it's, you can kind of think of it this way, like if you need to cure something, you've got an illness and you go to your doctor and they give you medicine, right? A good doctor is going to give you a certain dosage that they know will work. And then they'll check in with you and they'll say, how's it working? And they will maybe increase the dosage, maybe decrease the dosage, depending on the outcomes, right?
Mhm.
Um, and in a lot of situations, like the scientific rational approach is excellent for explaining the big picture stuff and why things work in the universe. How do you cure a disease? How do you deal with an outbreak of a virus? Things like that. How do you do all this? Um, but oftentimes the problems that we face they're not blanket problems that can be solved with a one size fits all. They are very situational and require a lot of bespoke customization. And that's, I think, where the magic steps in, is it
Yes.
says, okay, here's some things that we've observed over time. How do we combine these things so that they make sense for you now, for what you need? And I think magic is very, very good at creating very individualized solutions to very common and difficult problems.
Yes. So I love that because we talked earlier about these traditions being a little bit more culturally influenced, right? So
Mhm,
like for example, these observations of the Big Dipper.
mhm,
And now we have these cultural songs, Follow the Drinking Gourd,
mhm,
to help, people get to where they need to get, right? So something like that, we know through observation and through oral tradition, these
mhm,
systems can be passed down. But then now you're also saying, but the interesting fact about these traditions is that they're not only they're living, which
mhm,
allows them to be circumstantial and
mhm,
present at any given moment. You know what I mean?
mhm.
And I think that that is just so baller.
Yeah. Yeah, they evolve, right?
So
Like,
cool.
if
We
they're a living
evolve.
thing, they're going to evolve. They're going to change over time. Like the way that we
Yes.
did something 400 years ago, when we didn't have electricity and cars and things like and space shuttles, like it's different. So we
Yes.
have to be able to make those kind of adaptations every time. It doesn't mean that the magic didn't exist back then, but the container in which we put the magic, the shape has changed a little bit, but it's still
Exactly.
there and we can still
It's still
use it.
there.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and it is pretty baller.
So in your book,
Mhm.
which when what did encompass North America? Are we talking just the United States?
No, no,
Canada
and
too?
I wish we could have expanded even more than we did. We definitely did Canada. We have a French Canadian pair that wrote a lot about this sort of Quebecois, French Canadian sorcellerie tradition, which is really, really lovely. And we kind of touch a little bit on some stuff from other areas of Canada as well. And then we have a lot of stuff that's in kind of the United States area of North America, just because that's where a lot of the authors that we could contact were coming from. And then we move into a lot of kind of northern and central Mexico as well.
Nice.
And I would have really liked to go even further down than that, but it's just a matter of, you have to start drawing lines to be able to fit stuff.
Right.
And so that gave us a big chunk of this continent. But also, at a certain point, if you start going outside those lines, you're really going to start bumping into a lot more indigenous practices specifically. So like
Right.
if you go further into Canada, you're going to get into the Inuk practices, right? And that's
Right.
we're just not equipped to do that. I'm not equipped to edit a book that has that in there. So that's, again, I want to read that book. I want to read the book.
No, so smart choice in terms of the region area. So when we're talking about that particular area, what are some like fun little facts that you ended up reading about? Let's say let's focus just in the Americas. What are some fun little facts from, let's say, someone from New York or someone from Cali? Like, what did you find out?
Well, one, that no matter how much we want to regionally lock a practice, it's not regionally locked. So that's really important. So one of our authors on Brujeria, J. Allen Cross, he lives up in the Pacific Northwest, and his whole one of the points that he makes is like, yeah, you probably think that I should be writing about this and living in the Southwest, but you know what? I don't. So Brujeria, it exists in the Pacific Northwest, and let me tell you about that flavor of it. So I love that he was able to do that. One of our California folks, Benebell Wen, talks a lot about Taoist traditions and things like that, Taoist folk magic that has come over through Chinese immigration. And that's something that, yeah, she's writing about it in California, but you can find that in a lot of places. One of the biggest kind of movements of Chinese American people was during the late 1800s in Louisiana. So you could probably find some really strong connection. And this is why in for example, in some hoodoo formulations, you'll find things that are like lemongrass in these kind of like imported things that are coming from Asia and then being put into some of the products and formulations there. So
yes,
it's not regionally locked, which is wonderful because it shows you that we go everywhere. Magic travels everywhere, and we're, you can't just assume because you're in New Mexico that the magic you're going to bump into is Curanderismo. There's a good chance it might be.
Yeah.
But it's just as likely to be hoodoo, right? It's just as likely to, it could even be sorcellerie, right? From French Canadian practices, because people move around.
Yes.
So I love
and like you said, it evolves and grows because now they're going to be using the plants and the things from that particular region and incorporating it into their practice. So it's just such a beautiful, I mean, it truly is like sort of this melting pot, all American kind of vibe. It gives that vibe. And I think it's a beautiful thing because everyone kind of adds their own little flavor no matter where they are. So it's like, what's your flavor? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I like thinking of it like the melting pot is one of those things where I sometimes think about it. I'm like, oh, it's an interesting metaphor because it does sort of assume that we're all in the pot together, but it also assumes homogeneity. And what I think more of a stew or a really good chili, right? Like there's chunks.
A gumbo.
Yeah. Gumbo's a good one, right? We got chunks. There's chunky bits of us floating around. And you can find each of us in the individual things we contribute, but what's beautiful is kind of the way that we all make the dish sing. We make the dish come together. So
I love it. This time flew by and we're almost at the end. So I definitely want to ask that you let the people know, how they can reach you. If you have any upcoming projects, any new things you want to advertise, let us know. What's up?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for that. This has been so fun. You're right. Time has flown by. I just looked at the time when you said that. I was like, oh my gosh, it's already. So, but thank you. And Stephen wrote about Calarican folk traditions, which I love that. I love that there's that blend. Good example of that. So yeah, if people want to find me, my website, CoryThomasHutcheson.com. Is a good way to find all the different things that I do. NewWorldWitchery.com is the long-running podcast that I have done since 2010 with my partner Lane. Lots of great interviews with folk magicians over that time period. Like I said, we've got 250 some odd episodes at this point. So lots and lots of great interviews, great talks with some really wonderful people. So definitely check that out. My podcast co-host and I just finished writing a book that should be coming out this summer, which is called Conjuring the Commonplace, a guide to everyday enchantment and junk drawer magic, which basically looks at all the stuff in your house. It's sort of like, hey, do you have Lailani, tell me, do you have like a little button jar or button tin for like your sewing kit and stuff like that?
Yes.
Okay. Or like, do you have that junk drawer where you have like the mismatched forks or the the old stuff that you don't want to throw? Yeah. So we all do. We all have it. And so what we did was we unpacked all that and we said, okay, well, what's the folklore behind these little things, and are there magical uses?
Oh, that's so fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very like cottage core.
I
Kind of
love it. Oh,
stuff
that's
that
gonna
it's
be a
doing.
hit. Oh,
Yeah,
for sure.
that's a big one. And then later this year, I'll also be re-releasing the 10th anniversary of my first book, which is a book on using playing cards for folk divination and stuff like that. So, and
Nice.
hoping to, have some sessions for people to book if they want to get divinations. But then I'll also have this book that is kind of expanded. It's about twice as long and shows people how to use playing cards for divination and also looks at the folklore behind that. So
I love it. I
busy
love
person,
it.
lots going on.
You
So
are a busy person. Well, I am so excited to hear more from you and to see your upcoming projects. Definitely became a fan after your podcast because I was following your podcast for like ever. But now that we're in our last 5 minutes, is there anything in particular you want to, just kind of let our audience know? We have a lot of people actually here tonight. It's
Mhm.
interesting. We have Stephen, Jamal, 5 Point Hermetic. Hey, Jenny girl, Ralph, Tina, Marius. Oh my gosh, there's so many people. Zelma. So, there's a lot of people watching us live and definitely a bunch of people that are going to watch us on the replay. Is there anything you'd like to say to them or share before we sign off?
Well, first of all, I think we need to celebrate how amazing your nails are because I've been seeing those all night and they look so good. They look
Thank
so
you.
good. You did an amazing job. And they have that kind of like almost that blue from like the anti-evil
Yeah.
eye charm, which is just I fucking love that.
Thank you.
So claps for that. But my big thing that I always kind of ask people to do when you're thinking about folk magic, it can get really easy to sort of be like, oh, look at that folk magic they have over there. I really want to learn about that folk magic. And then they get to this point where they say, oh, I wish I had that. I wish I had stuff like that. But
Yeah.
I can guarantee you, after doing this for years and years and years, if you just turn to your community and maybe don't use the word magic, but if you turn to them and ask them about things like, well, what do we do when someone's born? What do we do when someone dies? What do we do when someone needs help finding a job? You're going to find you have a much richer tradition around you than you thought you did. It's
Mm,
worth asking those questions and talking to your community and getting that information if you can. And remember, you're not just one community. There's many folk communities that you're part of. So
wonderful.
thanks.
Cory, thank you so, so much for joining us tonight and for
Oh, thank
sharing your
you.
wisdom with us. And I hope that you'd come back because
I
I know
love that.
you're definitely going to be doing great things, even greater than you're doing now. And I would love to have you back on the show for sure.
I'd love to come back. You were a delight to talk to. So thank you so much for having me.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel, The Magical Solution. Make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. Definitely check out the description below so that you can follow Cory. And most importantly, remember, this is how we grow. Have a good night, everybody.